One of the more important reactions, chemical reactions that your carboxylic acids are going to undergo is in the formation of another class of organic compounds known as esters. So what esters are, they're compounds made from the reaction of a carboxylic acid with an alcohol. All right, so these reactions are known as esterification reactions. All right, and generally in these reactions, what we're going to see is a carboxylic acid plus an alcohol producing an ester, and we also release water as one of the byproducts of this reaction. This reaction generally happens in the presence of heat and some sort of an acid catalyst. Right? It's one of the more important reactions that your acids and alcohols are going to undergo with each other. Esters, the ester functional group, is found commonly in different biomolecules like fats and oils, but they are also responsible for the very pleasant smell that you associate with things like bananas or oranges or strawberries or pears, or the smell of wintergreen, right? All of those pleasant aromas are actually due to the presence of an ester. So the ester functional group, right, if you remember, looks like this. So there's a C double bond O, there's an O, and then those are surrounded by carbons on either side, right? So it looks similar to a carboxylic acid because it's actually made from a carboxylic acid, but now instead of having an H over here attached to that oxygen, that's replaced by a carbon, right? So that's your ester functional group. And esterification, like we said, is the process of making an ester from a carboxylic acid and an alcohol. All right, so for example, if you take a look at how that process can happen, you will see, first of all, we have our acid over here, ethanoic acid, and we have our alcohol, which would be our methanol. So the carboxylic acid and the alcohol can react together, and specifically what happens here is the OH from the acid and the H from the alcohol combine, right? So we have H and OH that produces the water molecule. Okay, and then what remains, we're just going to stick those together. So if we take the stuff highlighted here in green out, all right, we're going to link then the things in yellow. So we have now this C double bond O here is going to connect with that O, and that O brings with it that CH3. So then we end up forming our ester bond right here. So the ester bond, or the link, connects the acid with the alcohol, right? And when you look at an ester bond, it's a lot easier to determine which part of the ester came from the acid and which part came from the alcohol, right? You can first of all find that ester bond, and you can draw a line right down the middle, and then wherever you see that carbonyl, this part of it came from the carboxylic acid, and then the other part of it would have come from the alcohol. Right? That's how you make a little bit of sense of the ester functional group. So we can take a look at, for instance, at an ester that's responsible for the smell of pears. All right, and that ester is formed when ethanoic acid reacts with 1-propanol And again here, when you draw these molecules, it's a good idea to draw them so that the functional groups that are going to react, if you draw them right next to each other, it's a little bit easier to interpret what's happening. So the OH from the acid combines with the H from the alcohol, right? And that makes water as one of the byproducts. And then what remains, we're just going to stick them together. So we have this part here in yellow remaining from the acid, and then we have this part here in yellow remaining from the alcohol. And we're just going to stitch those together with a bond between this carbon and a bond between this oxygen, right? So this is the new bond that we make right here that I'm pointing to in red. All right, and then that's our ester that we end up making. In this case, the ester is called propyl ethanoate, and we'll talk about the naming here in a second. So let's take a look at how we can draw these or write these reactions. So it says write the balanced chemical equation for the reaction of propanoic acid and methanol. All right, so let's draw these. Propanoic acid, a 1, 2, 3 carbon acid. And then methanol is just a 1 carbon alcohol, CH3OH. So what I like to do, and I mentioned this briefly before, is to draw the reactant so that the portions of the molecules that are going to react, I can put them right next to each other. So I'm going to redraw this now in this form, right? That's still CH3OH, but now I've drawn it so I can see. Let me just finish up my arrows here. You'll notice that the arrows go in both directions, which means this is a reversible reaction. And it says heat, and we have an acid catalyst. Those are the typical conditions for forming an ester. All right, and then we're going to do the same thing that we saw before. We're going to combine the OH from the acid with the H from the alcohol. All right, so that's going to produce water. I'm going to draw that right here, so H2O. And now I'm going to highlight everything in yellow that doesn't change from the acid, and everything in yellow from the, let me do it in a different color. Everything in green from the alcohol that doesn't change. And I'm just going to link those together with a bond between the carbonyl carbon. All right, so I'm going to redraw everything that doesn't change. So I still have my 3 carbons, 1, 2, 3, the C double bond O. All right, that was the part of the acid that didn't change. And then I have this thing here that doesn't change. From the alcohol, and then I'm just going to combine or link that new bond between the acid and the alcohol, right? So if I were to make a little bit of sense, right, there is the part of the molecule of the ester that comes from the alcohol, and then in yellow we have the part that came from the acid, and the new bond that I made was this bond right here. All right, and that links the acid to the alcohol to make our ester. And that's going to happen in every single esterification reaction. All right, you'll notice here that the only part of the molecules that change are these regions. Right, the remaining parts of the acid and the alcohol do not change. So when it comes to naming these esters, right, we're going to see there's a system that we use for naming the esters as well. And the esters are all going to have 2 names. There's going to be a first name, and then there's going to be a last name. Okay, the first name comes from the alcohol, and the last name comes from the acid. All right, so if we take a look at the example from above, all right, we had the alcohol that we used was methanol, And the way that we change it to be a first name is we drop the anol and replace it with YL. So it becomes methyl. And then the acid that we used was propanoic acid. Okay, and we're going to change this the same way like we did when we named the carboxylate ion previously. We're going to change it to end in OATE. So this becomes propano, and then we add the ATE ending. All right, so then the name for this ester up here then would be methyl propanoate. All right, so the first part of the name comes from the alcohol, this region, and then the last part of the name comes from the acid, which is the region in yellow. All right, and all of your esters are going to be named that way. So we can use the naming. Well, let's take a look at another example here really quick before we go any further. So if I have an ester that looks like this, all right, and we had to name that one. All right, so the first thing that you want to do is to identify that ester bond, which is right here. All right, and what I like to do is to just draw a line right down the middle of the ester bond, and then that tells me which part of the molecule came from the acid and which came from the alcohol. All right, so wherever you see that C double bond O, that tells you that that's the acid part of it, and then that means the other part has to be from the alcohol. All right, so the alcohol here is a 1,2 carbon alcohol. So that would be ethanol. And as a first name, that becomes ethyl. And then the acid that we have is a 1, 2, 3, 4 carbon acid. That's butanoic acid. And then this becomes, as a last name, it becomes butanoate. So then the name of our ester then would be ethyl as the first name, and then butanoate as the last name. All right, so oftentimes the way that you draw an ester is sort of opposite to the way that it's named, right? So when you draw it, you typically have the acid part first and the alcohol second. Well, when you name it, the alcohol part goes first and the acid part goes second. Okay, the next section here talks a little bit about some common esters that are used. So I'll leave that up to you to kind of read through those. I think that's really good information to know, specifically when it comes to looking at the lab, the esterification lab, which we'll do a little bit later on. But let's take a look at some practice questions down here and let's apply what we learned a little bit. All right, so it says to write the Iupac name for this ester. All right, so again, identify the ester bond. So there it is. And then I like to draw a line right down the middle, right after the carbonyl, and then that tells me then that where that carbonyl is, the C double bond O, this came from the acid. And then the other part would be from the alcohol. All right, so my alcohol here is a 2 carbon alcohol, so that would be ethanol. So as a first name, it becomes ethyl. And then I have a 1, 2, 3 carbon carboxylic acid, so that would be propanoic acid. And as a last name, that becomes propanoate. So then the name for my ester then would be ethyl propanoate, or propanoate if you want to pronounce it differently. All right, and then we have our next one here. It's just to write the Iupac name. Well, I think we did that one previously. I'll leave that up to you to take a look at that one. I mentioned before that esters are very commonly used or they're responsible for the fragrances of different perfumes, flowers, and fruits, etc. And what you'll see is that there is a typical ester, our main ester, that's responsible for lots of these different smells. So for example, this is a very pungent one. The smell of bananas is due to the ester known as pentyl ethanoate. All right, so what this means is that the acid that was used was ethanoic acid, which is a 2-carbon carboxylic acid. That's the part in red. And then the alcohol would have been a 5-carbon alcohol, pentanol, which is this part here in green. All right, and you can look at the other ones to see what esters are responsible for all of those different smells. All right, so let's take a look here at a couple examples. We'll take a look specifically at part B. Now we're given the name of the ester. We want to draw the structure of the ester. All right, so how do we interpret this first of all? So ethyl propanoate. All right, so first of all, this you need to recognize that this is an ester. The first part of it comes from the alcohol, right? And the eth here tells you it's a 2-carbon alcohol. And the ending, the propanoate, tells you it's a 3-carbon carboxylic acid. All right, so the way that we've drawn the esters so far is we've typically drawn the acid part of it first. So we have a 3-carbon carboxylic acid, 1, 2, 3. All right, that's your prop part of it. And then in order to make it an ester, we need to make sure and have that bond to the O. And that O connects the alcohol portion of the molecule, and that's a 2-carbon alcohol, so we just make 2 carbons. And that's it. That's the structure for ethyl, right? And we can confirm this: ethyl, 2 carbons, 1, 2. Propanoate, 3 carbons, 1, 2, 3. All right, and then your ester bond here, the actual bond that makes it an ester is that one.